For 80 days in 1944, London teetered on the edge of collapse, not from tanks or bombs dropping from high above, but from a relentless, humming terror that no one seemed able to stop. Streets emptied, sleep vanished. The city learned to live by sound, a mechanical growl that meant death was coming, and the sudden silence that meant it had arrived. And then, almost impossibly, the threat began to melt away. The reason? A secret American invention, no bigger than a milk bottle, that arrived from laboratories and factories and changed everything almost overnight. How could something so small break a weapon designed to be unstoppable? Just 1 week after D-Day, as Allied troops poured through France, Hitler made good on his promise. A vengeance weapon aimed at Great Britain. It wasn't a fleet or a bomber raid. It was something new, sudden and relentless, launched to punish London while the armies marched on the continent. The skies were about to get very, very dangerous. A dark shape slices the gray over the channel, sudden, fast, and utterly foreign, the V1. It isn't a plane, it isn't a bomber. It's the world's first cruise missile, an unmanned flying bomb launched from across the sea, programmed to find the heart of London. No pilot, no return, just metal, fuel, and a single deadly purpose. For anyone watching the horizon, that silhouette changes everything. War is no longer just formations and fronts. Now it comes at you alone, from the sky, on a cold mechanical wave. For Londoners, it's a terrifying new reality, a new kind of sky noise that drifts in on summer air and makes the city freeze. The V1's pulse jet engine emits a sputtering mechanical growl, a ragged, insectile drone that people quickly nickname the Buzz Bomb. It's not just sound, it's a moving threat. Windows rattle, dogs howl. Strangers stop mid-step and look up, trying to locate the streaking silhouette as it carves the channel. Mothers pull children inside. Street lights and church bells somehow feel inadequate. You learn to listen for it and to dread what comes next. But the true horror isn't the sound. It's the moment the buzzing stops. That sudden deafening silence is the last terrible warning, the split second that says the V1 has run out of fuel and is about to fall. People on the street freeze, or bolt, or pray. Mothers clutch children. Commuters look up as if the sky itself has gone mute. There is no time to think, only to react. A dive behind a wall, a scramble down the stairs, a scream swallowed by the hush. It feels like the world holding its breath, and while London braces for that plunge, elsewhere commanders still believe this menace is unstoppable. Back in Berlin, the mood is almost triumphant. The V1 looks like everything the Reich has been promised. Small, fast, and cheap enough to flood the skies. It skims low over the channel, hugging the ground to dodge radar. It costs pennies compared to a manned bomber and can be churned out by the thousands. For German planners, that combination feels like a cruelly efficient hammer. Speed plus stealth plus scale. Short of miracle, they think, London will break under a rain of these things. Their confidence hardens into a dare, a weapon so simple and so numerous that, they believe, no defense can stop it. Their top scientists run the numbers and deliver a cold, clinical verdict. Interception is a mathematical impossibility. Trajectories, closure rates, wing area, engine noise, every variable feeds into equations that simply don't converge. The V1 is too fast, too low, and too small. Its timing and wobble throw off any predictive firing solution. To score a hit would demand split-second precision and perfect timing that human gunners, existing fire control systems, and conventional shells cannot provide. This isn't bravado from Berlin, it's chalk on a blackboard, and that grim conclusion hardens plans and nerves. setting the stage for the perilous countermeasures to come. For weeks, the German math looks right. Brave British pilots still try. They sprint after the buzzing V1 second in fragile fighters, tearing across the channel at top speed, tipping wing and gun into a tiny, self-guided death. Every intercept is a knife edge. Fly too close, and the warhead detonates under your wings. Hesitate, and London gets another crater. On the ground, anti-aircraft guns are almost completely useless. The V1 skims low and screams fast, a tiny metal blur that vanishes before gunners can lock on. A direct hit is practically impossible. The odds of a shell striking that small, speeding target are under 1 in 10,000. In short, the defenses needed a miracle, not luck. The gunner's task is superhuman. In 30 seconds, sometimes less, he has to pick out a speck against the sky, judge its speed and angle, do the math in his head, and then fumble a tiny timer into an artillery shell with steady fingers. Wind bites the face. The battery is a hive of shouting and smoke. One miscount, one slip of the wrist, and everything fails. That shell must then explode at the perfect millisecond in the perfect cubic foot of air to have any chance. In practice, that means a gunner has 30 seconds to spot a buzzing silhouette, judge its speed and bearing, translate that into a tiny mechanical setting, and wind a microscopic timer to life. One misread number, one shaky hand, one fraction of a second wasted, and the shot is worthless. The odds are brutal. A direct hit is virtually impossible, and the margin for error is microscopic. For weeks, valiant crews fire thousands of rounds for almost no reward. It's a desperate failing shot in the dark. The first volley tears into London with a cold, mechanical cruelty. Whole streets become hurtling numbers in a nightly death toll. The V1s second arrive without warning, low and fast. The city's rhythm reduced to one terrible calculus. Hear the buzzing, count the heartbeats, hope the growl doesn't cut out. Anti-aircraft fire fizzes and fails. Fighters chase and miss. Buildings smolder. People who had been numb now tremble. Fear isn't just anxiety anymore. It's a constant physical thing pressing against skin and window glass. For weeks, the weapon seems unstoppable, and London holds its breath, waiting for the next strike and for an answer that doesn't come. But then, in late June, something changes. At first, it's a whisper, odd entries in gun logs, terse notes from radar operators, a murmur among fighter pilots. Reports arrive that simply do not fit the math. V1 second, halting their runs, spiraling into the sea, or bursting into clouds of scrap well before they reach London. Coastal observers watch the sky and rub their eyes. Impact maps that had been a bruised mess start to clear. The steady, terrifying rhythm of destruction stutters. Nobody has an answer. It feels like a trick of luck until the anomalies line up, forming a pattern that will soon stop the bombs in their tracks. Then, almost overnight, British defenses that had seemed nearly useless began to hit their marks. Fighter pilots who'd been gambling with buzzing warheads suddenly found their risky interceptions paying off. Anti-aircraft batteries that had been firing blind started trimming the V1 threat. Interceptions climbed from almost zero to a startling 24% small in raw numbers, immense in impact. For Londoners, it was a brittle, cautious relief. For commanders, it was a baffling puzzle. And for the skies over England, for the first time since the raids began, the sound of hope threaded through the roar of engines. Something had changed, and the city noticed. By July, the numbers defied logic. Interceptions jumped from a staggered 24% to over 60% in a matter of weeks. Londoners felt it relief threading through a city that had learned to live with a mechanical roar, and Allied crews tasted something close to disbelief. There was no bulletin, no press release, no brass claiming credit. The change came like a quiet miracle behind closed doors. Across the channel, German observers fumed. Their reports spoke of V1s second shredded aloft with almost no visible cause. Rumors and guesses spread, but for now, the secret remained, wrapped in silence, an invisible advantage that was beginning to turn the war's balance. The Germans were completely baffled. This sudden reversal didn't fit any of their models. Their first, almost instinctive explanation was painfully simple. The British must have better radar, or their gunners were somehow far more skilled than anyone imagined. It was an easy, pride-sparing theory, the kind that let commanders sleep at night while blaming the enemy's competence rather than admitting a blind spot in their own science. That assumption spread through briefing rooms like a rumor, but it also set the stage for deeper confusion because observers along the French coast were beginning to report something that would shatter that tidy explanation. But then the reports from German observers on the French coast came back and unraveled that neat theory. They described a scene that sounded like madness. V1 second arcing over the water and suddenly fragmenting in midair, no tracer streaks, no obvious hits, no blackout from anti-aircraft salvos. Men who'd spent their lives watching the sky swore the missiles simply exploded by themselves, often miles short of London. The contradiction was stark. If not better radar or braver gunners, then what? Whatever the British had done, it wasn't visible from a ship or a cliff top. It felt like someone had reached inside the air and flipped a switch. Then the observers on the French coast start reporting something impossible. V1 second simply detonating in midair, shredded to pieces with no visible cause. No tracer streams arcing toward them. No black puffs marking a direct artillery hit. Just explosions silent, sudden, and utterly baffling. Men who have seen 1,000 aerial engagements can't explain it. Pilots and coastal spotters trade stunned reports, scribbling times and coordinates as if cataloging a miracle or a crime. The pattern doesn't fit any known tactic or technology. Whatever is killing the buzz bombs, it's invisible, and the Germans watching from the beaches are starting to feel very, very uneasy. Then the numbers told a stranger story. British gun batteries were firing far fewer shells than the math said necessary, and yet V1 second kept coming down. A handful of rounds, not hundreds, and a buzz bomb would explode and fall. Observers on the French coast saw mid-air detonations with no tracer fire and no visible hits. The missiles simply shredded themselves. Probabilities failed to explain it. It looked like superhuman gunnery, or sabotage, or something far more unsettling, a hidden technology at work that the Germans could not and did not want to believe. Alarmed and humiliated, Oberst Max Wachtel does what commanders do. He moves fast, and he demands answers. He orders a formal investigation, dispatching teams of inspectors to scour factories, launch ramps, and maintenance logs. Wachtel cannot accept the headlines, something else must be wrong. To him, the simplest explanation is internal. Sabotage, sloppy workmanship, or a fatal design flaw. He presses his officers for confessions, for bodies to pin the failure on, because the alternative, an invisible, superior enemy trick, would be unbearable. Wachtel was desperate for an explanation. He paced through reports and photos, eyes hunting for a pattern, and finally settled on two grim possibilities. Either saboteurs were crippling launches at the source, slipping a blade into the machine of war, or the V1 itself had a fatal hidden flaw, some design error that betrayed it at the worst moment. Both outcomes were unbearable. Sabotage meant traitors in the ranks. A design flaw meant the Wunderwaffe was a lie. Either way, the commander knew his answer would rewrite the campaign. He ordered inspectors to tear everything apart and find which nightmare was true. Wachtel orders it. Inspectors swarm the French sites, rip apart launch rails, pry open V1 noses, strip engines, and guidance systems. They bench test every circuit, comb every weld, follow every bolt. Days turn into frantic hours, nothing. The missiles are flawless on the ramp, launching exactly as designed, and that only deepens the fear. Then a pattern emerges. The V1s second sail perfectly until they cross the channel, and only once they brush the British coastline do they begin to fail mid-air, inexplicably, often without a single visible tracer to explain it. That detail shifts everything. What had looked like technical teething or bad aim now reads like a targeted betrayal. German officers pace, scribble reports, and trade frantic, impossible theories. Sabotage at the launch ramps, coastal jamming, even British witches. The fact that the breakdown happens only at the water's edge deepens the mystery and feeds a growing paranoia in high command, because if it isn't human error, it must be something far stranger. At first, it's disbelief. Reports roll and bombs go silent over the coast, explode with no tracer, no visible hit, no obvious cause. What looked like skill or luck can't explain shells that don't score direct hits yet shred V1s second in midair. Fingers point inward. Sabotage, sloppy crews, busted launch gear. Inspections come back clean. Launch ramps function. Missiles are perfect. And suddenly their confidence begins to crumble. The only remaining explanation is terrifying. Not better gunners, not chance, but a hidden revolutionary technology, small, unseen, and so effective it turns every near miss into a kill. The truth was almost laughably small. Not a new bomber or giant rocket, but a tiny device no bigger than a milk bottle, the VT Fuse, and it was a top-secret American invention. For weeks, the Germans had been bracing for something grand, something brute force could meet, and instead, they were up against a compact, hidden brain that changed the rules of engagement. Quiet, mechanical, deadly. It fit into the tip of an ordinary shell and quietly turned ordinary anti-aircraft rounds into something the enemy had never imagined, which is why British defenses began to score impossible kills almost overnight. In essence, the Fuse is a miniature, self-contained radio station packed into the nose of an ordinary artillery shell, small, silent, and astonishingly clever. Think of it as a tiny, hardened brain, a transmitter, receiver, and trigger squeezed into a space no larger than a milk bottle, its components protected against the brutal shock of firing. It rides in the shell's tip, sealed and mercilessly precise, built to sense the world around it without human help. From that cramped metal point it can listen, send, and decide in an instant, and as the shell flies, that capability comes to life. As the shell streaks through the sky, a microscopic radio tucked into its nose begins to whisper steady, relentless pings that radiate outward. The waves are tiny, almost invisible, but when they strike something solid, say the metal hull of a V1, a sliver of that energy reflects back. The Fuse is listening the whole time, measuring the returning echo against a preset standard, turning those faint returns into a running readout of distance and speed. No human aims it, no direct hit is required, just that invisible call and response, and the shell knows exactly when it's close enough to become lethal. Then, the trick is disarmingly simple. As the shell flies, it constantly whispers a radio pulse outward. When that pulse hits something dense, the metal skin of a V1, or even the cloud of air around it, a tiny fraction bounces back. The Fuse is listening. When the reflected signal climbs to a preset strength, it closes a circuit in an instant, and the detonator fires. No aiming for a bullseye, no impossible accuracy. Proximity does the killing. In one tiny mechanical heartbeat, an ordinary shell becomes a flying, proximity-triggered mine, deadly without ever touching its prey. No direct hit is needed anymore. The shell only has to get close. A tiny, humming radio inside it does the rest. Suddenly, ordinary anti-aircraft rounds become smart, proximity-triggered mines floating in the sky. One burst, one timed echo, and the fuse tells the detonator to go. Clouds of metal shred anything within yards. The effect is immediate and brutal. Accuracy becomes less a matter of miracle marksmanship and more a geometry problem solved by machines. Where gunners once prayed for a miracle, they now load, aim, and watch the air itself rip the V1s second apart. This was the very weapon German engineers had tried and failed to build. They called it impossible. Not out of bravado, but because the physics and the practicality seemed to lock the idea away. 1. No one could imagine stuffing a working radio into the tiny, screaming nose of a shell. 2. Even if you did, how could any fragile tube or battery survive the cataclysmic shock of being fired tens of thousands of Gs, the equivalent of slamming into a brick wall? That conclusion calcified into certainty. They stopped hunting for a workaround, which of course is exactly what made the American breakthrough so fatal. How do you squeeze a whole radio into the tip of a shell? And how do you keep that delicate gear alive long enough to work after the shell is fired? On paper, it sounds like a neat engineering trick. In practice, it was a nightmare of scale and violence. Tiny valves, fragile filaments, batteries, the size of pills, all of it had to be shrunk, sealed, and made foolproof. Worse, the device would have to survive the launch. Blinding shock, wrenching vibration, instant acceleration. Those two questions were not academic. They were a gauntlet. Physics itself seemed to stand in the way. The forces involved are hellish. A shell goes from rest to supersonic in a blink, subjecting its innards to shocks measured in tens of thousands of Gs over 20,000 times the pull of gravity. Tiny wires and glass vials are slammed, twisted, and vibrated beyond recognition. Solder joints shear like brittle seams. Temperatures spike, mechanical shocks hit like a million tiny hammers. It's not just very violent, it's the sort of violence that shreds anything delicate. Picture that, and you begin to understand why anyone would call the idea of a working radio set tucked into a shell impossible. Imagine a tiny radio and a fragile little battery strapped into the nose of an artillery shell that, in a heartbeat, feels the force of 20,000 Gs, the equivalent of slamming into a solid brick wall at 2,000 miles per hour. Short, savage, and absolute. The shock would crush, shatter, vaporize anything we think of as delicate. Vacuum tubes, glass cells, filaments a human finger could snap. So how could any of those components possibly survive the launch? It sounds like science fiction. It sounds impossible. And that impossibility is exactly what makes the next chapter, how someone solved it, so staggering. Across the Atlantic, however, American ingenuity quietly resolved what everyone in Berlin called impossible. In a nondescript building at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Merle Tuve quietly launched a top-secret program at the Applied Physics Laboratory to build a fuse that could survive the hellish forces of being fired. It was clandestine in every sense, compartmentalized, urgent, ruthlessly practical, a wartime sprint from basic physics to battlefield hardware. Tuve didn't bet on one lone genius or rigid command. He began assembling the tools and the teams that would knit industry, academia, and consumer tech know-how into a weapon the enemy refused to imagine. At Johns Hopkins, Tuve didn't just recruit experts, he built a workshop of minds. Physicists, radio men, metallurgists, even practical tinkerers, thrown together and told to trade ideas freely. Rank took a back seat to curiosity. Whiteboards filled, prototypes multiplied, failures were logged and reused. The atmosphere was noisy, democratic, fast, the exact opposite of Germany's rigid, top-down labs where secrecy choked creativity. That open, iterative culture mattered more than anyone expected. It made the team willing to steal solutions from odd places, to try unlikely fixes, and set them up to pull a surprising breakthrough out of the margins. The crucial breakthrough came from somewhere no one in uniform expected: commercial hearing aid technology. Small, low-power vacuum tubes had already been perfected for tiny earpieces, miniature, efficient, and built to take everyday knocks. The Johns Hopkins team spotted the connection. If you could make a tube that worked in a pocket radio or an earpiece, maybe you could make one that survived being fired from a gun. It sounds ridiculous, but that civilian know-how solved the twin problems of size and fragility, and the idea was passed to firms like Sylvania to be ruggedized into the tiny heart of a world-changing fuse. The breakthrough wasn't some exotic German miracle, it was plain, stubborn engineering. Sylvania's teams took the tiny, fragile filaments used in hearing aids and learned to package them like eggs for war. They encased the filaments in layers of wax and hard plastic, a shock-absorbing cradle that stopped the wire from snapping the instant the shell was fired. Tests were brutal and repetitive: drop rigs, centrifuges, live firings until the filaments survived the hammer blow of launch. This simple cushioning turned an impossible idea into a reliable component and set the stage for another clever trick: a glass battery that only came alive when the shell was shot. Then came an even stranger trick: a tiny glass battery tucked into the fuse's bow, a vial that was completely inert until the gun fired. The shock of launch shattered the ampoule, two chemicals mixed, the circuit closed, and the little radio woke up in an instant. It was a device designed to be brought to life by violence, built to survive the 20,000 G punch of being hurled down a barrel. Paired with the wax and plastic cushions Sylvania had invented for the filaments, the result was almost magical: delicate electronics that could not be killed and, crucially, could be manufactured by the millions. Germany obsessed over brilliant, handcrafted wonder weapons. They prized precision, secrecy, and a few spectacular machines. America took the opposite route. Short sentence: instead of one miraculous device, U.S. engineers designed something cheap to make, easy to assemble, and deadly in great numbers, then handed the plans to entire industries. Consumer plants retooled, assembly lines hummed. Workforces swelled, mostly women, doing tiny, exacting tasks that together produced scale no single artisan could match. The result wasn't a better bomb. It was overwhelming production, over 100 factories quietly building the same small miracle, turning scientific cleverness into a flood the Germans couldn't stop. It wasn't built in a single lab or under one roof. The Fuse project quietly sprawled across more than 110 factories, a maze of assembly lines and tiny rooms, each doing one piece of the puzzle and nothing more. Production was ruthlessly compartmentalized. Engineers in one plant never saw the parts made next door. Assemblers fitted components they were told were critical but never fully explained. Blueprints were sliced and scattered like code words. The result was scale and secrecy at once: millions of delicate, battle-hardened fuses flowing out of ordinary factories, each worker playing a small, indispensable part in a much larger, hidden machine. Inside those 110 factories, most of the workers, and a majority were women, had no idea what the tiny pieces on their benches would become. They stood at humming lines, hands moving in practiced, rhythmic motions, slotting parts together because they'd been told only one thing. This was a vital component that would save lives. The work was fiercely compartmentalized. Secrecy wrapped every station, so no single person ever saw the whole. They worked quietly, driven by pay, pride, and an urgent sense of doing their part, stitching together millions of little miracles that would turn the tide far from their assembly tables. Companies like Crosley, the same name on radios and refrigerators in American kitchens, ripped up their shop floor blueprints and rebuilt them for war. Big consumer presses became precision jigs. Assembly lines that once cranked out polished Bakelite knobs now fed tiny secret components into crates bound for England. Engineers rewrote production manuals overnight. Managers trained whole new workforces. Most of the women at the benches didn't know what those parts would do. They only knew speed mattered and secrecy mattered more. What had been a business of comforts turned, in a flash, into a machine for survival, quiet, relentless, and built to scale. Driven by patriotism, these workers assembled millions of the complex fuses, ready to overwhelm the limited number of V1 second Germany could ever hope to launch. Day after day, largely women at benches, riveters, and solderers turned tiny, delicate parts into hardened instruments of war. One screw tightened, one contact checked, one seal snapped, then on to the next station. They didn't need to know the whole plan. Precision and secrecy were enough. Quality control was relentless, because one dud could cost lives. Out of retooled radio and appliance factories, American industry quietly turned a brilliant idea into a tidal wave of ordnance that London's attackers simply couldn't match. By August 1944, the trap is set. Along the Channel coast, the British throw up a forbidding line of steel and sand gun pits, searchlights, coastal batteries, and razor wire code named the Diver Belt. It's a simple, brutal choreography. Trained crews, stacked ammunition, and those secret proximity shells waiting in the racks, ready to turn the sky into a killing ground. Then the Americans rolled out the SCR 584 seconds radar masterpieces that changed the game. Sleek, automatic, brutally precise, they picked up each buzzing V1 and tracked it in real time, turning fleeting blips into confident locks. Suddenly the sky stopped being random. It became data targets you could aim at, predict, and, if everything lined up, destroy. The SCR 584 doesn't just watch, it speaks. Radar tracks a buzz bomb, computes a firing solution in a blink, and feeds that data straight into the gun's aiming gear. Motors whir, hydraulics bite, barrels pivot with machine-perfect timing. No frantic manual corrections, no last-second guessing. Where men once had to eyeball angles and trust luck, a cold, precise loop now closes the gap between detection and destruction. The human role shrinks to one simple, vital task. Keep the belt fed, load the shells, and let the machines do the killing. All the gun crews have to do is load the shells, the special shells equipped with the secret VT fuses. The rest is done for them. SCR 584 radar locks on. Predictors feed aim data. The guns pivot and track automatically. No frantic timer setting. No desperategueses. They simply stand ready, racks full of quiet little time bombs, waiting for the buzz bombs to fly into the trap. The next wave of buzz bombs dives into the kill zone, and the whole sky explodes. Anti-air batteries fire in tight, mechanical rhythm. Shells arc like metal rain, and each burst opens into a bright, tearing cloud of shrapnel. V1s second are ripped to pieces, mid-flight nose cones shredded, fuel igniting, wreckage trailing down. Men on the ground freeze, mouths open in disbelief. It's a sight no one expected. Ordinary shells turned into a precise airborne trap, turning the space between gun and target into a lethal, invisible net. Then the fuses did the unthinkable. They turned the air into an invisible, deadly web. Tiny radio hearts pulsed from each shell, listening for the faintest echo of a passing V1. When the echo hit the preset strength, the circuit closed and the shell exploded not on contact, but beside it, so a near miss became a lethal embrace. Suddenly, every burst of shrapnel hung in the sky like a trap, each detonating round a miniature mine that didn't need a direct hit to tear a buzz bomb apart. The result was surgical, relentless, and completely unexpected by anyone watching from below. Now a near miss is as lethal as a bull's eye. Shells don't need to find the V1's tiny fuselage, they merely need to explode close enough, and the air becomes a lethal net. Clouds of razor-sharp shrapnel bloom and spread, catching wings, chewing through pulse jets, tearing fins like paper. Missiles that minutes before screamed over the channel flicker, disgorge smoke, and break apart in mid-air, pieces tumbling into the sea long before they reach London. Pilots and ground crews watch, half stunned, half relieved, as the once invincible buzz bombs disintegrate around invisible lines of metal and the kill rate begins to climb. The results were immediate and staggering. On a single late August day, the skies over the channel turned into a kill zone. 82% of incoming V1 second were shredded or detonated long before London could be touched. Anti-air batteries that had been shooting blind weeks earlier now fired precise, radar-guided barrages, proximity-fuzzed shells, and automatic tracking stitched an invisible net across the approaches. Londoners who had learned to freeze at the buzz and drop woke instead to a hollow triumph, a rain of fragments where death had been expected. For the Germans it looked like a nightmare, as if some unseen force were turning their vengeance into dust. In Berlin, the mood flips from confident to terrified almost overnight. The high command can barely hide its disbelief. Reports come in and Oberst Wachtel's memos grow sharper, more frantic. He stamps his papers urgent. He paces. He orders new inspections and then orders them again, absolutely convinced that someone, somewhere, has sabotaged the launch sites or the supply chain. The other possibility feels impossible, that the Allies have built a device Germany could not imagine. That thought is unbearable, and it makes every failure feel less like bad luck and more like a personal betrayal. By early September, the nightmare simply stopped. The V1 offensive was broken, the kill rate so high that the flying bombs ceased to be a strategic weapon, and the steady drip of terror that had haunted London evaporated. People who had learned to sleep with one ear tuned for a sudden silence now found the silence itself a kind of miracle. Streets that had been half ruined, faces lined with grief, suddenly filled with cautious relief. It wasn't luck. It was technology, logistics, and secrecy working together, tiny fuses, mass production, better radar, and better tactics, all of it quietly turning the tide until the skies over London fell, at last, quiet. The secret of the VT fuse was absolute. Not a single one fell into German hands during the campaign, every component made in secrecy, every worker kept in the dark, every shipment a puzzle piece that never revealed the picture. That veil of silence turned German confidence into a fatal blind spot. Their scientists, certain of their own superiority, wrote the idea off as fantasy. They couldn't imagine such miniaturized, rugged electronics existed. So they hunted for sabotage, for launch site errors, for anything but the truth. They never found the device and would only be forced to confront it after the war. After Germany surrendered, Allied interrogators casually set a single object on the table, a captured VT fuse. The room went quiet. The Third Reich's top scientists leaned in, inspected the tiny bottle-sized device, then fell into stunned silence. No bluster, no excuses, only sheepish, almost embarrassed admissions that their own work was years, perhaps a decade behind. For them, it was a humbling moment, the desperate certainty of genius undone by a small, practical invention and the industrial muscle to make millions. The silence said more than any report ever could, proof that technological arrogance can blind even the best minds. The little fuze's victory proved something bigger. Modern wars are won not only on battlefields but in dim labs and on endless assembly lines. A tiny, secret device assembled by thousands, engineered by a handful, turned artillery into an invisible net and made the fearsome V1 impotent. It wasn't glamour or a single monstrous weapon that saved London. It was hundreds of factories, clever engineering, and people, mostly anonymous women, doing steady work at scale. After the war, even captured German scientists had to admit they'd been leapfrogged. So we're left with this uneasy lesson. Do we prize the loudest weapon or the smartest idea multiplied millions of times?